In this video, we're going to go over one of your assigned readings. You may be wondering why we're bothering to do this. After all, you know how to read. You've gotten this far. Well, to do well as an urban planner, reading is a really important skill. And often it's not just about reading interesting materials. Some of it can be pretty dry. So the goal of this video is to go over one of your readings in detail so you understand how to read carefully and closely in the way that an urban planner would read. You're going to have a chance to do this with a lot of different kinds of readings, but for now we're going to start with one that's fairly broad, that is focused on how we understand the city and its relationship to urban design. We're going to look at Urbanity, which is chapter 1 in Kim Dovey's book called Urban Design Thinking, a Conceptual Toolkit. Dovey is a very highly regarded urban design scholar based in Australia, and his work is actually very accessible, so I think it's not a bad reading to start with. That said, it still is somewhat academic leaning in nature. So let's start with the first paragraph of this reading, which focuses right away on the relationship between urban spaces and difference. As we'll see throughout this reading, the notion of difference is hugely important to cities. Here, Dovey shows us how several key terms connected with city life all have this connection with difference, and in ways that are generally positive. For example, he notes that because of difference, it's all the more important to have courtesy, to respect others' rights, and to appreciate the opportunity that public space gives us to interact with new and different people. He believes that public space helps us expand our worlds. But this is the direct opposite of private, which has its origins in deprivation. Now, this may sound like a bit of an academic exercise, splitting hairs over definitions, but later on, the idea of how cities deal with difference through design and construction becomes hugely important. And in fact, on the first paragraph of the very next page, the last sentence, Dovey reminds us that public space helps us find something in common with strangers, with people that we perceive as different. This helps anticipate the possible expectations that function creates for urban design. So if you think about it, if a space is meant to bring people together who may be at risk of misunderstanding each other because of difference, we know that we will have to take steps to ensure it prevents misunderstanding and conflict, even as it encourages and celebrates the good things about encountering things and people that are new to us. The next 3.5 pages of this article cover a very high level summary of someone else's work, Richard Sennett, as a way of helping us see that our understanding of public space and our design responses to it have shifted over time. These shifts have taken place as there have been major changes in the big ideas about how the larger society should work. The first example that he talks about is the democratic society of ancient Greece and the open, undefined notion of the agora, or common space. The theme here was openness and flow. Of course, that only applied to a certain elite group of men. It didn't apply to women or slaves. The next example, Rome, was a much more hierarchical society and therefore a more controlled approach to communicating. It was not democratic, and as a result, the open spaces became a lot more structured and formal. Next, he discusses Middle Ages Europe, where we see even more structure imposed, response in part as a reaction to what I would call stranger danger. So the design response was a lot of compartmentalization and segregation through ghettos. Things shift again in the 18th century Enlightenment period. Once more, we see a desire for openness and visibility and freedom. And there was even a lot of influence on their perceived notions of ancient Greece. But by the 19th century, something else happens. There's a new emphasis on individuality. This really is a novel thing and a big departure from a lot of the major ideas of the past. The result for public open space? Recognizing that you can lurk anonymously in public space. You can be part of something without having to say or contribute anything. You can watch strangers without having to interact with them. Debbie briefly mentions the urban flaneur, which is an idea of somebody whose job is simply to absorb the city in a very leisurely way. Debbie also mentions that not all of this is positive. You know, if you want to be anonymous in a crowd, you still have to feel safe. So there's a new emphasis on a need for government monitoring to ensure there's no conflict. This surveillance can be protective, but it can also be exhausting. Hence, a shared social desire to retreat more to private space and impose more and more order on the public space. In this context, Dovey tells us that urban design has to focus on control and on certainty. On page 13, Dovey ends this part of the chapter with two key takeaways. The first, that encounters with difference are a focus of urban life. We know that. The second, which is a bit more unexpected, is that difference is not just something simple that we notice right away. Instead, it's something we encounter in stages, and through the process, unraveling difference helps us figure out who we are. The next section, which spans 1.5 pages, begins with the heading, What's at Stake? It reminds us why cities and the differences they bring matter. They can stimulate wealth and ideas, and they can also shrink distance. Knowing this doesn't eliminate our need to be mindful of how power relationships will structure urban spaces. Still, this process won't be a simple unilateral one. There will always be debates, disagreements, and protests that will impact how power controls design. Dovey reminds us that it takes many people and an interest to make a vital city. And as a side detail, he paraphrases German philosopher Walter Benjamin by suggesting we perceive the city subconsciously as it washes over us. This means that we'll notice some parts more than others at different times. The concluding point in this section is that designers should care about the result of their designs and how they cause us to experience and benefit from public space. And this is completely opposed to some approaches that focus more on appearances or aesthetics. The final part of this reading, which comes under the heading The Urban DMA, is a bit of a teaser. It's some hints about where the author's own approach to urban design is going to go in the rest of the book, which we're not reading in this class. But it also covers where he drew his influences. Dovey reveals that Jane Jacobs has been a strong role model for him because she's been very interested in promoting diversity as well. So you can start to see this common theme here, but it's just yet another way of looking at diversity. So to achieve the diversity that Jane Jacobs advocates, Dovey updates her ideas and regroups them into 3 themes instead of 4. And he labels these density, mix, and access. This is a bit simpler in some ways, but it's also more flexible and adaptable than the way that Jacobs first expressed them. As we progress through this course, we'll keep coming back to these 3 ideas because they'll help us connect with and focus on our goals for planning. That is, good end results, rather than obsessing just about the tools that we might use for getting there. I hope that this analysis of one of your readings has been helpful to you. I won't be imposing this on you all the time, but I just thought it would be really a good way for me to unpack for you some of the things that I took as valuable from this reading. And you might take a similar approach as you engage with some of the other literature through this course.